Hello everyone, and welcome to Whispering Woods. I'm here to help you unwind tonight, to slow your breathing, clear your thoughts, and drift into calm. Find a comfortable place, let the world outside fade, and just listen. Before we begin, if stories like this help you find a little peace at the end of the day, feel free to like this video and subscribe to Whispering Woods. It lets these quiet tales keep finding the ones who need them. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? The evening light falls soft through ancient windows, touching everything with amber and gold. And somewhere in the distance, a clock tower counts the hours in patient, gentle tones. The air itself seems to hold memory here, carrying with it the scent of old paper and rain-washed stone, of gardens left to grow as they will, of time moving slowly, kindly, like water over smooth river stones. There is comfort in this slowness, in the way shadows lengthen across wooden floors, in the quiet rustle of pages turning in distant rooms, in the knowledge that some places exist outside the rushing current of ordinary hours. There was a bookshop I used to know, tucked between two larger buildings on a street that curved like a question mark, and it existed in that particular way that some places do, half in the world, half in memory, wholly in the space between what was and what might yet be. I found it on an autumn afternoon when the light was failing early, the way it does when September slides into October and the year begins its long, gentle descent into sleep. I'd been walking without purpose, the kind of walking that happens when your thoughts are too loud and the only remedy is motion, is the rhythm of feet on pavement, is the steady scroll of unfamiliar streets unfolding like pages in a book you're reading for the first time. The day had been difficult in ways I couldn't quite name, not dramatic or crisis-filled, but heavy with a kind of existential weight that settles in your chest and makes even simple tasks feel effortful. I'd tried all my usual remedies, coffee in a favorite cafe, music through headphones, phone calls to friends who listened patiently but couldn't quite reach the place where I was struggling. So I walked, letting my feet choose the path, turning down streets I'd never explored, following nothing but instinct and the fading light. The neighborhood was old, the kind of area that had been elegant once, then forgotten, and was now hovering in that liminal space between neglect and rediscovery. The buildings were tall and narrow, pressed close together like old friends sharing secrets. Trees lined the sidewalks, their leaves just beginning to turn, edges touched with gold and crimson. The air smelled of wood smoke from someone's fireplace, of damp earth, of the particular melancholy sweetness that autumn brings. The sign above the door said simply, "Midnight and Company, Booksellers." The letters were painted in fading gold, and beneath them, in smaller script, Proprietor. E. Midnight. Hours by appointment and accident. I stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, studying the storefront. The windows were crowded with books stacked in towers and arranged in careful displays, their spines facing outward like a wall of colors and textures. A small lamp glowed somewhere inside, casting warm light that spilled out onto the darkening street. Through the glass, I could see more shelves stretching back into shadow, and something about the depth of that space, the way it seemed to extend much further than the narrow building could logically contain, made my heart beat faster with a feeling I couldn't quite identify. Not fear, but a kind of anticipation, a sense of standing on the threshold of something important. I pushed open the door. It moved on hinges that sang a low, warm note, like a cello, and stepped into a space that seemed much larger than the narrow storefront suggested. The air inside was cool and still, smelling of leather bindings and dust and something else, something like rain about to fall, or the moment just after a candle is blown out when the smoke curls upward in delicate spirals. The ceiling disappeared into shadows high above, and the walls were entirely covered with shelves that rose toward that invisible upper limit. Books filled every available space, but not in the haphazard way of a storage room or the rigid order of a modern bookstore. These volumes seemed to have arranged themselves according to some organic principle. I couldn't quite grasp by color in some sections, by size in others, and in still others by what might have been emotional resonance or thematic connection. Poetry nestled against philosophy, gardening manuals leaned companionably on volumes of astronomy, and cookbooks shared shelves with collections of correspondence between long-dead lovers. Shelves rose toward a ceiling I couldn't quite see, disappearing into shadow that gathered like quiet water in the upper reaches of the room. Books lined every surface, stacked on tables, piled in corners, arranged in towers that leaned at impossible angles yet never fell. Some of the spines bore titles I recognized. Others were blank, or written in languages I didn't know, or marked with symbols that seemed to shift when I looked at them directly. "You're early," said a voice from somewhere within the labyrinth of shelves. I turned, searching for the speaker, and found instead a narrow corridor between two bookcases that I was certain hadn't been there a moment before. The voice came again, warmer this time, touched with something that might have been amusement. Or perhaps you're late. It's difficult to tell with these things. A figure emerged from the shadows, a woman, perhaps 60, perhaps older, with silver hair pulled back in a loose knot and eyes the color of smoke. She wore a cardigan the blue of twilight and held a leather-bound volume in her hands, her fingers marking a place, as though she'd been interrupted mid-sentence. There was something timeless about her, as though she could have stepped out of any decade in the past century and would have looked perfectly natural in each. "I'm sorry," I said, though I wasn't sure what I was apologizing for. "I didn't know you were by appointment only. I can come back. Nonsense." She waved away my words with her free hand, and I noticed her fingers were ink-stained, a writer's or reader's hands, permanently marked by their work. I said, "Ours by appointment and accident. You're clearly the latter, which is just as valid as the former. More interesting, usually." She studied me with those smoke-colored eyes, and I had the distinct impression she was reading something written on my face, some text invisible to me but perfectly clear to her. "You're looking for something." It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. "I suppose I am, though I'm not sure what." "The best searches begin that way," she said, and smiled. The expression transformed her face, made her look both ancient and youthful at once. "I'm Eleanor Midnight. Most people call me Ella. This is my shop, in the way that anything truly belongs to anyone. The books and I have an arrangement. I provide the shelves, they provide the wisdom, and together we wait for the right readers to find their way here." She set down the volume she'd been holding. I glimpsed the title, something in Latin that my high school education couldn't translate, and gestured to the surrounding maze of literature. Take your time. Walk where you feel drawn. The books have a way of finding their readers, if you let them. Don't think too much about what you're looking for. Just wander and pay attention to what catches your eye, what makes you pause. The right book always reveals itself, though not always in the way you expect. And so I wandered. The shop seemed to reconfigure itself as I moved through it, new aisles opening where I was certain only. Walls had been, staircases appearing that led to mezzanines I hadn't noticed from below. Everywhere, books, fiction and philosophy, poetry and science. Histories of real places and atlases of imagined countries. I found a section devoted entirely to books about rain, meteorological studies, literary collections of rain-themed poetry, memoirs set in the wettest places on Earth, even a slim volume that claimed to teach the reader how to predict rain, using only ancient folk methods and attention to natural signs. If stories like this calm your thoughts, you're home here in Whispering Woods. Another shelf held books about dreams, Jungian analysis and surrealist manifestos, and scientific studies of REM sleep and collections of dream diaries, kept by everyone from medieval mystics to modern artists. A third section was devoted to texts on the art of cartography and the drawing of maps, everything from technical manuals on surveying to philosophical treatises on how we construct spatial understanding to beautiful coffee table books filled with reproductions of medieval maps that showed dragons in the margins and paradise at the eastern edge of the world. I found books I remembered from childhood, volumes I'd checked out from libraries decades ago and thought were long out of print. I found books I'd never heard of, but somehow felt I'd been searching for all my life. I found empty books, their pages blank and waiting, and books so full that words seemed to overflow the margins and spill onto the shelves themselves. Time moved strangely in Midnight and Company. I would pause to examine a spine, open a cover, read a few pages, and look up to find that the light coming through the windows had shifted from afternoon gold to evening blue, or that what had been evening blue was now the deep purple of true night. The clock on the wall, an old piece with a moon face and elaborate hands, showed times that seemed more suggestion than statement. 1:30, almost, 1:45, nearly, just before soon. The deeper I went into the shop, the more I felt I was traveling not just through space, but through some other dimension entirely. The books here were older, their leather covers cracked and soft with handling, their pages thick and slightly rough, the kind of paper that had been made by hand from rags and pressed in wooden molds. The smell was different too, more resinous, touched with beeswax and what might have been myrrh. I found myself in a corner of the shop where the shelves were older, the wood dark and heavy with age, and the books themselves seemed quieter somehow, as though they were resting, gathering strength between readings. A single armchair sat beneath a brass lamp, its light falling in a perfect circle that reminded me of spotlights in old theaters, or the way the moon illuminates a clearing in a forest. The chair looked impossibly inviting, its leather worn, smooth and soft, a knitted blanket draped over one arm, a small side table holding an empty teacup and saucer. Everything about this corner suggested comfort. safety, the kind of space where you could settle in and let the world recede, where time would slow to match the rhythm of your breathing, where whatever weight you'd been carrying might finally be set down, at least for a little while. One book caught my attention, a slim volume bound in green cloth, its spine marked with silver letters that spelled out, "The Cartographer's Daughter." I pulled it from the shelf and the book came away easily, as though it had been waiting for my hand specifically. It was lighter than I expected, and when I opened the cover, I found the pages were made of that same thick, handmade paper I'd noticed in the older volumes. The inside cover bore a bookplate showing a compass rose and the words Ex Libris, E. Midnight. The leather was soft, worn smooth by countless readers before me, and it seemed to adjust to my shape as though it remembered every body that had ever sought comfort in its embrace. The brass lamp cast its warm glow over the pages, and outside the circle of light, the shop receded into gentle shadow. I could hear, very faintly, the sound of Eleanor moving about somewhere in the distance, the soft shuffle of books being reshuffled, the quiet music of a space being tended with care. I opened the book and began to read. In a city built on 7 hills, the book began, where the streets ran like rivers between buildings of gray stone, and the rain fell so constantly that people forgot what dry pavement looked like. There lived a girl named Iris who drew maps of places that didn't exist. She was the daughter of the city's official cartographer, a serious man who spent his days in a tower office measuring angles and calculating distances, ensuring that every street and alley was recorded with perfect accuracy on the great maps that hung in the city's council hall. He believed in precision, in the absolute truth of measurements, in the idea that the world could be captured completely if only you were careful enough with your rulers and your ink. Iris believed in other kinds of truth. She drew her maps on whatever paper she could find, the backs of her father's discarded sketches, the blank end pages of books, the smooth inner bark of the birch trees that grew in the park near their house. Her maps showed countries that existed only in morning dreams, cities that could be reached only by walking backward, oceans that flowed upward into clouds instead of being contained by shores. The prose had a particular quality, a rhythm that seemed to match the gentle pace of my breathing. I found myself reading slowly, savoring each sentence, letting the words create their images in my mind without rushing. There was no pressure here, no deadline. Nothing but the story unfolding at its own measured pace and the comfort of the chair and the warm light of the lamp. The story continued, describing Iris's childhood in the rainy city, her relationship with her father loving, but marked by a fundamental difference in how they saw the world, and her gradual development as a map-maker of impossible territories. She mapped the emotional geography of her city, charting the corners where people always seemed to smile, the alleys where sadness collected like rainwater, the squares where joy burst suddenly into being, like street musicians appearing on sunny afternoons. She drew maps of time, showing which neighborhoods existed perpetually in autumn and which in that sweet, green moment of early spring. She created atlases of memory, marking all the places where important things had happened to people, first kisses and last goodbyes, moments of courage and instances of grace. She made maps of sound, tracing the acoustic geography of the city, showing where echoes lingered longest and where silence pooled deep enough to drown in. I read on, absorbed in the story, and as I did, I became aware of a curious thing. The bookshop around me seemed to be shifting in response to the narrative. When Iris walked through rainy streets, I heard the soft patter of water against the windows of Midnight and Company. When she climbed to the top of her father's tower and looked out over the 7 hills, I felt a breeze move through the shop, carrying the scent of distant weather. When she sat in the park drawing her maps on birch bark, the smell of trees and earth seemed to fill the air around me. I looked up from the page and found that afternoon had become evening, had become night. The lamp beside my chair created an island of warm light in a sea of gentle shadow. Somewhere in the shop, I could hear Eleanor Midnight moving about, the soft sound of books being reshuffled, the quiet music of a space being tended with care. You're listening to Whispering Woods, where every night brings another quiet tale. She appeared at the edge of the lamplight, as if summoned by my attention, carrying 2 cups of tea balanced on a small tray. She offered me one. The cup was delicate china, hand-painted with tiny birds in flight, and settled into a second chair that I was certain hadn't been there before. The tea was fragrant, tasting of bergamot and something else, something I couldn't quite name, perhaps starlight, perhaps the particular flavor of contentment that comes when you've found exactly where you're meant to be. "The story holds you," she said. Not quite a question. "That's a good sign. It means you're the right reader for it." I wrapped both hands around the warm cup, letting its heat seep into my palms. "Who wrote it?" I asked. "There's no author listed." Eleanor smiled over the rim of her cup. "The best books are like that. They exist without needing to be attributed. They're written by everyone who reads them. In a way, each reader brings something to the text, adds their own understanding, their own experience. The words on the page are just the beginning. The real story happens in here." She tapped her temple. "And here?" She touched her chest, just over her heart. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping our tea. The shop around us seemed to breathe, to settle into evening the way an old house does, with small sounds of wood adjusting and the whisper of pages stirring in unseen drafts. Outside, through windows I hadn't noticed before, I could see the street lamps coming on, their light soft and golden against the deepening blue of dusk. "The first time I read that book," Eleanor said quietly, breaking our companionable silence, "I was about your age. Younger, maybe. I'd just moved to this city, didn't know anyone, felt completely lost. I wandered in here. The shop belonged to someone else then. A man named August who collected rare volumes and unusual readers in equal measure. And August handed me that exact book. Said I looked like I needed a map." She paused, looking into her teacup as though reading tea leaves, seeing the past, reflected in the amber liquid. "It helped me find my way. Not literally, I still got lost on the bus routes for months afterward, took the wrong trains, ended up in strange neighborhoods at odd hours, but in here, and here," she repeated the gesture, temple and heart. "It reminded me that being lost is just another way of saying you haven't found your place yet. That the map you need most isn't always the one that shows you where streets go, but the one that shows you where you go, what matters to you, how to chart your own course through a world that doesn't always make sense. I thought about that as I returned to my reading. The idea that being lost wasn't failure, but just a temporary state, a necessary step in the process of finding yourself. It felt revolutionary and obvious at once, the kind of truth that seems simple but changes everything once you really understand it. The story of Iris progressed. She grew from a child into a young woman, and her map-making evolved with her. She began to collaborate with others, musicians who could hear the city's hidden songs, painters who saw colors ordinary people missed, poets who understood that sometimes the truest way to describe a place was through metaphor rather than literal representation. One of her most important collaborators was a boy named Thomas. He appeared in the story gradually, first as a figure Iris noticed sitting on a bench in the park where she often drew, then as someone she encountered repeatedly in her wanderings through the city, and finally as a friend, a partner, someone who understood her work in a way few others did. Thomas collected forgotten songs, lullabies that grandmothers sang but that were never written down, work songs from industries that had closed decades ago, street vendors' calls from markets that no longer existed. He carried a notebook filled with musical notation, transcriptions of all the songs he'd found hiding in the corners and crevices of the city. He taught Iris to listen differently, to hear the world as a composition constantly being written, and she taught him to see differently, to understand that space itself could be musical, that distance and proximity had their own rhythms. Together, they created something new. Sonic maps, charts that showed not just where things were, but how they sounded, what emotional frequency they resonated at. They mapped the quiet places, libraries, and late-night cafes, churches in the hour after morning services, the rooms where people kept their most treasured memories. They mapped the loud places to markets and train stations, construction sites and festival grounds, anywhere that noise and energy collided and created something that felt almost alive. But their maps went deeper than simple documentation of volume. They charted the quality of silence in different locations, the heavy, anticipatory silence of a concert hall before the orchestra begins, the peaceful silence of a garden at dawn, the anxious silence of a waiting room, the comfortable silence between old friends. They marked places where sound took on unusual properties, where echoes lasted impossibly long, where whispers could be heard across vast distances, where certain notes seemed to resonate with the architecture itself and create harmonics that didn't exist in the original sound. I found myself slowing down as I read, savoring each page, reluctant to rush through the story. There was a quality to the prose that demanded that kind of attention. The sentences had a rhythm to them, a music, and I realized that the book itself was doing what Iris and Thomas did in the story, creating a kind of map through language, charting emotional territories and the geography of human connection. The relationship between Iris and Thomas developed with the same care and attention they brought to their map-making. There were no grand declarations or dramatic moments. Instead, their love emerged gradually, organically, through shared work and growing understanding. They learned each other's rhythms, discovered how to move in complementary patterns, found that they could communicate sometimes without words, just through shared glances or the way they simultaneously reached for the same color on a map or the same note in a sequence. If your eyes are growing heavy, that's how you know you're safe here, safe in Whispering Woods. The narrative took time with their quiet moments sitting together on a bench overlooking the city at twilight, walking through neighborhoods in comfortable silence, sharing meals in small restaurants where the owners knew their names, working side by side in Iris's studio with nothing but the scratch of pens on paper and the soft rustle of maps being unfolded and refolded. These scenes were rendered with the same detail as the more active moments, suggesting that these pauses, these spaces of simple companionship, were just as important as any grand adventure or dramatic discovery. I paused in my reading and looked up to find that Eleanor had vanished as quietly as she'd arrived. My teacup had been refilled. I didn't remember her doing it, but the tea was still hot, still fragrant, and a small plate of cookies had appeared on the side table. They were homemade, dusted with sugar, and when I tried one, it tasted of butter and vanilla and something that might have been nostalgia, a flavor I couldn't quite identify, but that reminded me powerfully of childhood afternoons at my grandmother's house. Outside, full night had arrived. Through the shop's windows, I could see the street was quiet, the few pedestrians moving like shadows beneath the street lamps. Inside, the brass lamp continued its vigil, casting its steady glow over the pages of my book, and I returned to the story. The plot deepened as Iris and Thomas's work caught the attention of the city's officials. The narrative treated this development not as triumph, but as complication. Their private, personal map-making was now being asked to serve public purposes, and they had to decide what that meant, what they were willing to share, and what needed to remain intimate and protected. The city council wanted practical applications for their emotional cartography. They wanted maps that would help with urban planning, that would show where to build new parks or reroute traffic or establish community centers. There was merit in these requests. Iris and Thomas's work could genuinely help improve people's lives. But there was also danger. The maps they made came from deep attention and careful listening. Could that translate to bureaucratic applications without losing something essential? The story didn't offer easy answers. Instead, it followed Iris and Thomas as they wrestled with these questions, as they argued and compromised and gradually found ways to maintain the integrity of their work while also sharing it more widely. They created a new kind of map, layered and complex, that could serve both practical and emotional purposes simultaneously. At the heart of their solution was Iris's father, the official cartographer. He appeared more frequently in the second half of the book, and his relationship with Iris evolved from that early tension between precision and imagination into something richer. He began to see that his daughter's work wasn't a rejection of his own, but a complement to it, that both kinds of mapping were necessary and valuable. There was a beautiful scene where the three of them, Iris, Thomas, and Iris's father, worked together in the tower office, surrounded by maps both practical and impossible. The father brought his expertise in measurement and scale, his understanding of how to create documents that could actually be used for navigation and planning. Iris and Thomas brought their knowledge of emotional topography, their ability to represent things that couldn't be measured with rulers but were no less real for that. Together, they created something unprecedented, a map that showed both the literal streets and the felt experience of those streets that could guide you from one location to another, while also preparing you for what you might feel, see, hear, encounter along the way. The creation of this map formed the climax of the story, but it was a quiet climax, built not on conflict or crisis, but on collaboration and gradual understanding. The narrative spent pages describing their process, how they discussed each element, how they experimented with different ways of representing information, how they learned to speak each other's languages and find common ground between seemingly incompatible worldviews. I realized as I read that the book was teaching me something about attention, about the value of slowing down and really looking at things, really listening. In a world that constantly demands speed and efficiency, that asks us to skim and scan and move on quickly to the next thing, this story insisted on lingering, on taking time, on allowing meaning to emerge through patient observation rather than rushed consumption. The maps that Iris, Thomas, and the Cartographer created together became treasured resources for the city's inhabitants. Newcomers used them to find not just addresses, but belonging, to discover which neighborhoods would feel like home, and which cafes would become their regular spots, and which parks would speak to their particular kind of loneliness or joy. Longtime residents used them to rediscover their own city, to see familiar places with fresh eyes, to understand that the geography they thought they knew completely still held mysteries and revelations. But the story didn't end with this success. Instead, it continued on, following Iris and Thomas through the years, showing how their work evolved, how they trained others in their methods of attention and representation, how the practice of emotional cartography spread and developed and became something larger than any individual practitioner. The book's final section was the most moving. Iris's father grew old and eventually died, leaving his tower office to his daughter. Thomas's hearing began to fail, a tragedy for someone who'd spent his life collecting sounds, but he adapted, learning to experience music through vibration and visual representation, finding new ways to contribute to their shared work. Iris herself continued making maps well into her old age, though her hand grew unsteady and her eyes grew weak. The story ended not with a dramatic conclusion, but with a quiet image. Iris, elderly now, sitting in the park, where she'd first drawn maps on birch bark as a child, watching a young person sketch something in a notebook. She didn't approach them, didn't offer advice or share her experience. She simply watched, recognizing in their concentration and care the same attention she'd brought to her own work all those years ago, understanding that the practice would continue, that new map makers would arise, that the work of charting emotional territories and invisible geographies would never be finished, because the world kept changing and there would always be new territories to explore. The final sentence read, and Iris smiled, knowing that some maps don't show you where to go, but remind you that you're already where you need to be. I closed the book gently, as one does when ending a conversation with a good friend, reluctant to break the connection, but knowing that all stories must eventually conclude. I sat for a long time in the lamplight, holding the closed volume in my hands, feeling its weight, its presence, the way it seemed to contain more than pages and ink could logically hold. When I finally looked up, I found that the shop had transformed around me. Or perhaps I had transformed and was now seeing it differently. Either way, everything seemed slightly more vivid, more present. The shadows were richer, the lamplight warmer, the air more fragrant with book smell and tea, and that indefinable scent of shelter and safety. Eleanor appeared again, moving through the aisles with a grace that suggested long familiarity with the space, knowing exactly where to step to avoid that one board that creaked, where to duck to avoid the beam that hung slightly lower than the others, where to reach without looking to find the book she sought. "You finished," she said, though it wasn't really a question. She had a way of stating facts that felt like gentle observations rather than declarations. "I did," I confirmed. It was. I trailed off, not sure how to complete the sentence. Beautiful, yes, but also more than that. Important, necessary, like medicine I hadn't known I needed. "I know," Eleanor said, simply. She understood without my having to explain, which was one of the many gifts she offered. The gift of not having to translate your internal experience into inadequate words, of being recognized and comprehended without the labor of explanation. She gestured to the book in my hands. "You can borrow it if you like. Bring it back when you're finished, or when it's finished with you, whichever comes first. Before you drift off, remember to follow Whispering Woods for tomorrow's story." "Finished with me?" I asked. "Books do that, sometimes," she said. "They work on you, teach you what you need to learn, and then they're done. You might want to keep reading them, but they release you, in a way. Let you go." She tilted her head slightly, considering. Of course, the truly important books are never really finished. You can return to them years later and find they're completely different, showing you new things, because you're different and you bring new understanding to the reading. I looked down at the Cartographer's Daughter in my hands. "How will I know which kind this is?" "You'll know," Eleanor assured me, "and either way is fine. Some books are meant to be brief encounters, others are lifelong companions. Both kinds matter." I thanked her and moved toward the door, but slowly, reluctantly. The shop had become a refuge in the few hours I'd spent there, a pocket of peace and quiet and gentle wisdom, and the thought of leaving it, of stepping back out into the ordinary world with its noise and demands, felt almost painful. Eleanor seemed to understand this too. "We're here," she said simply. "The shop doesn't go anywhere. You can always come back." "How do I find you again?" I asked. I wasn't really paying attention to how I got here, and these streets all curve so strangely. She smiled. "You'll find us when you need to. That's how it works. People stumble on midnight and company by accident when they're ready for it, and once you've found us once, you'll always be able to find us again. The shop has a way of staying accessible to its readers." And so I left, stepping out into the cool night air with the book tucked under my arm and a strange lightness in my chest, as though some weight I hadn't even known I was carrying had been set down inside the shop and left there, at least temporarily. The weeks that followed were different. I can't pinpoint exactly how the external circumstances of my life didn't change dramatically, but something internal had shifted. I found myself paying attention differently, noticing things I'd previously rushed past. the way morning light fell across my apartment floor, creating geometric patterns that changed with the seasons. The particular quality of silence in the library on weekday afternoons. The sound of rain on different surfaces, metal, glass, leaves, stone, each creating its own music. I read The Cartographer's Daughter 3 more times in those first few weeks, finding new details with each reading, passages I hadn't noticed before, nuances in the relationships that only became clear with familiarity, layers of meaning that unfolded like origami in reverse, revealing hidden complexity as I opened them rather than elegant simplicity. And I returned to Midnight and Company, sometimes by accident and sometimes on purpose, though the distinction between those two categories became increasingly blurred. I would set out for the grocery store or the post office and find myself instead on that curved street, standing before the shop's door with no clear memory of having decided to go there. Or I would deliberately try to find it and would walk for an hour without success, only to turn a corner on my way home and discover the familiar storefront waiting for me, as if to say, "Not yet, but now. Yes, now you're ready." Each visit to the shop revealed new dimensions. I discovered that the bookcases themselves were works of art, hand-carved with intricate designs that told stories. Here, a forest scene, complete with tiny animals hidden in the foliage, there an ocean vista with sailing ships and sea creatures, elsewhere a city skyline rendered in such detail that you could see individual windows lit in the buildings. I found secret doors that led to reading rooms I hadn't known existed, each one themed and decorated to suit particular moods or genres. A nautical room with ship's lanterns and the sound of waves, a forest room where branches seemed to grow across the ceiling, and birdsong played softly from hidden speakers. I met other readers, regular visitors to Midnight and Company, who had their own relationships with the shop and their own stories of how they'd discovered it. There was Marcus, a retired professor who came every Tuesday afternoon to read poetry aloud in a small alcove where the acoustics made every word ring clear and true. There was Lily, a landscape designer who studied botanical references and old gardening manuals, making notes for the public park she was planning. There was James, a composer who came seeking inspiration in books about mathematics and astronomy, finding patterns in the stars that he translated into musical sequences. There was Sarah, a painter who read travel, memoirs, and then tried to capture the described places in watercolor, creating images of lands she'd never visited based purely on someone else's words. We became a kind of informal community, we readers of Midnight and Company. We didn't gather deliberately or organize meetings, but we recognized each other, nodded in passing, occasionally shared discoveries, Marcus recommending a particular poem to Sarah because it reminded him of her painting style. Lily showing James a passage about the mathematical patterns in flower petals, me pointing out to Marcus a volume of translated Persian poetry I thought he'd appreciate. Eleanor presided over all of this with gentle, unobtrusive care. She was always present, but never intrusive, appearing when needed and fading into the background otherwise. She had a gift for knowing exactly when to offer tea and when to maintain silence, when to suggest a book and when to let readers discover their own way. She moved through the shop like a gardener, through a well-loved garden, tending but not controlling, shaping but not forcing. As autumn deepened into winter, The shop transformed with the seasons. The light changed, growing longer and more golden in the afternoons, and Eleanor brought out heavier blankets for the reading chairs. She kept a kettle going constantly, offering cups of tea or hot chocolate to anyone who came in from the cold. The smell of the place shifted too. Now the book scent was overlaid with cinnamon and cardamom from Eleanor's tea, wood smoke from the small fireplace I'd never noticed before, but which now burned cheerfully in a corner room. I continued exploring the shop's ever-changing landscape, and I began to understand what Eleanor had meant about books finding their readers. I would be drawn to a particular shelf without knowing why, and there I'd discover exactly the volume I needed sometimes, one that addressed a question I'd been pondering, sometimes one that introduced me to a question I hadn't known to ask, sometimes one that simply offered comfort or beauty with no utilitarian purpose at all. On one particularly cold December evening, I discovered a whole section of the shop devoted to atlases and travel narratives. The books here were large and heavy, bound in leather that had been stamped with gold leaf, their pages thick and occasionally illustrated with hand-colored maps and drawings. I spent hours that night pulling down volume after volume, tracing routes across continents I'd never visit, reading accounts of journeys to places that no longer existed or perhaps never had. One atlas caught my attention, an 18th century volume showing the Pacific Ocean, with notations in English, French, and what might have been Polynesian. The maps themselves were works of art, decorated with compass roses and sea monsters, and tiny ships sailing across vast expanses of blue. But what fascinated me most were the marginal notes, added by various owners over the centuries, commenting on the accuracy of certain routes, correcting measurements, adding information about currents and winds and the locations of safe harbors. These books were palimpsests. I realized texts that had been written and rewritten, each reader leaving their mark, adding their knowledge, correcting and expanding what came before. They were collaborative works spanning centuries, created not by single authors but by communities of readers and travelers and dreamers who'd felt compelled to add their own understanding to the accumulated wisdom. Wasn't that what all reading was, really? Each of us bringing our own experience to the text, interpreting through the lens of our own lives, adding our own meanings, even if we never wrote them down. And wasn't that what Iris had understood in The Cartographer's Daughter, that maps were never complete, never final, but always evolving as people moved through the territories they depicted and brought back new information, new perspectives, new understanding? I took my insight to Eleanor, who was reorganizing a shelf of Victorian novels, arranging them not by author but by the color of their covers, creating a gradient from deepest burgundy to palest pink. She listened as I explained what I'd been thinking, nodding occasionally, and when I finished, she said simply, "Yes, exactly that. You're beginning to understand how reading really works, not as passive reception but as active creation, as a collaboration between writer and reader, between the text and your lived experience." She gestured to the shop around us. That's why this place exists, really, to create space for that kind of reading, that kind of attention. The world outside moves so fast, demands so much, insists you extract information efficiently and move on to the next thing. Here, you can slow down. Here, you can read as slowly as you need to, return to passages multiple times, sit with ideas until they fully unfold. Here, reading is not about consumption, but about communion. Winter deepened. The days grew short and the nights long, and I found myself spending more time at midnight in company, arriving in the early darkness and staying late, reading by lamplight. While outside the windows, snow began to fall, soft and steady, transforming the city into something quiet and clean. During one of these long evening visits, Eleanor asked if I'd ever drawn my own map. Of your city, she clarified, the way Iris did in the book, your emotional geography. I admitted I hadn't, though the idea had been germinating in my mind since I'd first read The Cartographer's Daughter. You should? She said. Not because you need it, I think you've already found your way, at least for now, but because the act of making a map is different from following one. It requires you to pay attention in new ways, to see with fresh eyes, to decide what matters enough to mark down and what can remain unmarked. So I began. I bought a large sheet of quality paper and good pens, in various colors, and I started charting my personal topography of the city. It was slow work, meditative work, requiring me to remember and evaluate and choose which places had shaped me, which moments had mattered. What did I want to remember, to honor, to carry forward? I marked the cafe where I'd first felt brave enough to sit alone and enjoy my own company, the park bench where I'd realized I could be content without knowing what came next, the bridge where I'd scattered my mother's ashes 3 years ago and felt both the weight of grief and the lightness of release. I marked midnight and company, of course, placing it at the center of my map because it had become central to my understanding of myself and my place in the world. But I also marked things I hadn't expected, to include the corner where I'd once helped a lost tourist find their hotel and felt the warm satisfaction of being helpful, the alley where I'd discovered an incredible mural that seemed to show my own life, story, rendered in abstract shapes and colors, the subway platform where I'd overheard a conversation that had shifted my entire understanding of a relationship I'd been struggling with. The map grew complex, layered, full of tiny symbols and notes that wouldn't make sense to anyone but me. That was exactly right. It wasn't a guide for others. It was a record of my own journey, a testament to attention paid and moments honored. As I worked on my map over the course of several weeks, I found that the process itself was transformative. Paying attention to which places mattered forced me to consider why they mattered, what they'd given me, how they'd changed me. And the act of marking them down, of giving them space on paper, felt like a kind of gratitude, an acknowledgement that these places and moments had been important, had contributed to who I was becoming. When I finally showed the completed map to Eleanor, she studied it for a long time, tracing routes with her finger, reading my notations, asking occasionally about a particular symbol or place. She said finally, "You've learned what Iris knew, that the most important maps are the ones that show us not where we've been, but who we've become in the going." Winter gave way to spring, with that particular suddenness that feels like miracle. One day the world was gray and frozen, and the next there were crocuses pushing through the last patches of snow, birds returning with their complex songs, light falling at new angles through Eleanor's windows, and touching the books with gold. The shop transformed with the season. Eleanor opened the windows on mild days, letting fresh air circulate among the stacks, and I swore I could hear the books themselves breathing, exhaling their collected dust and wisdom, drawing in new oxygen that somehow made the ink on their pages darker and more vivid. I noticed during this time that my relationship with reading had fundamentally changed. Before finding Midnight and Company, I'd approached books as objects to be completed, items to check off a list, sources of information to be extracted and filed away. Now I understood that reading could be something else entirely, a practice, a meditation, a way of being present and attentive. I read more slowly now, and somehow I retained more. I read fewer books, but understood them more deeply. I returned to volumes I'd previously considered finished, and found them entirely new. The shop had taught me this, or perhaps allowed me to learn it. Eleanor's gentle insistence that there was no hurry, her creation of space where time moved differently, her understanding that some books required months or years to fully read all of this, had given me permission to approach literature not as something to conquer, but as something to experience, to live with, to let work on me gradually, the way water works on stone. As spring deepened toward summer, I found myself spending long afternoons in Midnight and Company, sometimes reading, but just as often simply sitting, breathing, existing in the peaceful space Eleanor had created and maintained. I watched other readers come and go, observed their own transformations the way they'd enter, looking harried or lost, and gradually, over the course of hours or weeks, become calmer, more centered, more themselves. One warm afternoon in May, Eleanor asked if I'd like to help her with a project. The shop needed organizing, not strict alphabetical or categorical organization, but an intuitive rearranging that would help books find their proper readers. "I do this every spring," she explained. "The books tell me where they want to be, and I help them get there." We worked together for hours, and I discovered that Eleanor was right. The books did seem to communicate their preferences. Or perhaps I was learning to read the shop's own logic, its organic system of arrangement. This book wanted to be near the window where afternoon light would fall across its cover. That one needed to be hidden in a corner where only determined seekers would find it. These three belonged together even though they'd been written centuries apart and were about completely different subjects. Something in their essence harmonized. The work was meditative, requiring attention but not strain, demanding presence but offering peace. We moved books and shifted shelves and occasionally stopped to read passages aloud to each other, marveling at beautiful sentences or surprising connections. Eleanor told stories about previous owners of certain volumes, the readers who'd loved them before, the journeys some books had taken before arriving at Midnight and Company. As we worked, I realized I was being taught something, though I couldn't have said exactly what. Perhaps it was about trust, trusting intuition, trusting the process, trusting that things would find their proper places if given time and attention. Perhaps it was about care, the importance of tending things gently, of respecting the history and presence of objects. Perhaps it was simply about being present, about doing work that required your full attention and therefore pulled you completely into the moment, leaving no room for anxiety about past or future. Summer arrived, and the shop took on a drowsy, golden quality. Dust motes danced in the thick afternoon light, and the heat made everything slower, more languid. Eleanor served iced tea now instead of hot, and she placed fans strategically throughout the space to keep air moving. The books seemed to settle deeper into their shelves, as if they too were relaxing into the warmth. It was during this summer that I first noticed the garden. I'd been exploring a section of the shop I didn't remember seeing before. The shelves here held books about plants and gardening, herbalism and landscape design when I discovered a door, partly hidden behind a tall bookcase. The door was painted green and had a glass panel through which I could see foliage, actual growing things moving gently in a breeze. I opened the door and stepped out into a courtyard garden I hadn't known existed. It was small, maybe 20 feet square, surrounded by the tall buildings of the neighborhood but somehow separate from them, enclosed and protected. Plants grew everywhere in raised beds and pots, climbing trellises and spilling out of hanging baskets. There were vegetables and flowers and herbs, all thriving in what seemed like impossible density, everything growing together in a profusion that somehow never became chaotic. Eleanor was there, kneeling by a bed of tomatoes, her hands in the soil. "I wondered when you'd find this," she said, without looking up. "Everyone does eventually, if they spend enough time here. The garden has its own timing, like everything else." I stepped fully into the space and immediately felt cooler, calmer. The sounds of the city traffic, sirens, construction faded to a distant murmur, replaced by birdsong, and the rustle of leaves and the quiet buzz of bees visiting flowers. The air smelled of growing things, of earth and chlorophyll, and the particular sweetness of ripe tomatoes warming in the sun. "This is where I come when I need to remember," Eleanor said, standing and brushing dirt from her hands. "The books are wonderful, essential. But sometimes you need something living, something that grows and changes, something that reminds you that all wisdom isn't stored in words on pages, but also in seeds and soil, and the patient unfolding of seasons." I helped her garden that afternoon, learning the names of plants I'd never known, understanding for the first time the satisfaction of putting your hands in earth, of tending living things, of being part of the cycle of growth and decay and renewal. Eleanor taught me which herbs needed more water, which vegetables were ready for harvest, where to pinch back growth to encourage fuller plants. We worked mostly in silence, the companionship of shared labor requiring no words. From that day forward, the garden became part of my visits to Midnight and Company. I'd read for a while, then step outside to pull weeds or water plants or simply sit on the bench Eleanor had placed in one corner, letting the green piece of the space wash over me. I began to understand that the shop and garden were part of the same project. Both were about creating space for growth, for attention, for the slow work of becoming. As summer deepened, I noticed myself changing in subtle ways. I moved more slowly, spoke more thoughtfully, listened more carefully. The constant, low-level anxiety I'd carried for years, the sense that I should be doing more, achieving more, becoming more, began to ease. Not because I was doing more, but because I was learning to value what I was already doing, to recognize that attention and presence were their own kind of achievement, perhaps more important than the conventional markers of success I'd been chasing. The other, readers of Midnight and Company, noticed my transformation, though no one commented on it directly. Instead, they began sharing more with me Marcus, reciting new poems he'd discovered, Lily inviting me to see the park she was designing, James playing me recordings of his latest compositions, Sarah showing me her watercolors. I realized I'd become part of the community, not just as a visitor, but as a participant, someone who contributed to the shared understanding and appreciation that made the shop what it was. One evening in late August, as golden light slanted through the windows and made everything glow with warmth, Eleanor asked me to stay after the shop closed. "There's something I want to show you," she said, and her tone held a weight I hadn't heard before, a seriousness that made my heart beat faster. After the last visitor left and she'd locked the front door, Eleanor led me up a narrow staircase I'd never noticed before. It spiraled upward, lit by candles in wall sconces, climbing higher than should have been possible given the building's exterior height. We emerged into a circular room at the very top, a room that seemed to exist in some impossible space beyond the shop's architecture. The walls were covered with maps, not purchased maps or decorative reproductions, but hand-drawn originals, hundreds of them, covering every available surface. Some were old, the paper yellowed and fragile, the ink faded to brown. Others were recent, their colors still bright, their lines still sharp. Each one showed a different version of the city emotional geographies, sonic topographies, temporal atlases, memory maps. Every keeper of the shop has made these, Eleanor explained, gesturing to the collection. Each of us, in our time, trying to understand and represent the world we're moving through. This is August's work. She pointed to a series of maps rendered in precise architectural detail. And this is Clara's before him. These maps were more fluid, almost impressionistic. And Santiago's before her. His maps incorporated musical notation, showing the city as a kind of score. And these, Eleanor said, moving to a section of newer maps, are mine. Her maps were extraordinary layered watercolors showing the city at different times of day in different weather, as experienced by different moods. She'd mapped the city's booksellers and libraries, its quiet corners and loud intersections, its places of shelter and spaces of exposure. Looking at them, I understood Eleanor better than I could have through any conversation. I saw her values, her priorities, her way of seeing and being in the world. "I'm leaving soon," Eleanor said quietly, stepping sideways like August did before me. "It's time. The shop needs a new keeper, someone who can tend it for the next chapter, help the books find their readers, maintain this space where time moves differently and stories can breathe." My heart clenched. When? Weather turns and the light begins to change. But who will? I stopped, because I already knew the answer. I'd known it, perhaps, since that first evening when Eleanor handed me the cartographer's daughter and said I looked like I needed a map. "The shop chooses its keepers," Eleanor said, echoing words she'd spoken months ago. "And I think it's chosen you, if you're willing. I can't stay forever, no one can. We each have our season here, and then it's time to step aside and let someone else take a turn." The rest of that evening passed in a blur of instruction and information. Eleanor showed me the practical aspects of running the shop, the accounts and inventory systems, the sources for rare books, the networks of collectors and dealers she worked with. But more important than these practicalities was the philosophy she conveyed, the understanding that Midnight and Company wasn't really a business, but a calling, a form of service, a way of creating and protecting space for something essential and increasingly rare in the modern world. "It's not really about books," she said for perhaps the 10th time that night. "The books are vehicles, tools, portals. What this place actually offers is permission to be slow in a fast world, to be curious without immediately needing answers, to exist outside the constant pressure of productivity and purpose. It offers sanctuary, not religious but literary, a kind of shelter that protects not your body but your attention, your ability to be present, your capacity for wonder." The weeks that followed were strange, beautiful, and sad in equal measure. Eleanor began preparing for her departure, slowly and methodically. She showed me every corner of the shop, revealed secrets I'd never guessed, a collection of letters from famous writers hidden in a false-bottomed drawer, a first edition signed by its reclusive author, tucked behind later editions on the shelf, a book that only appeared on certain nights of the year and showed different content to each reader who opened it. She introduced me to the shop's special visitors, the ones who came only once a year or once a decade but whose visits were important, who needed specific books or specific conversations, or simply the reassurance that Midnight and Company still existed, still offered its particular brand of shelter and silence. We worked together in the garden, harvesting the last of the summer vegetables, planting bulbs for spring, preparing the beds for winter. Eleanor taught me which plants to protect with mulch, which could survive the cold unshielded, which needed to be brought indoors. The physical work of gardening became a metaphor for the work of tending the shop, protecting what was fragile, trusting what was hardy, creating conditions for growth rather than forcing it. The other readers learned of Eleanor's impending departure, and we gathered one evening in September for a kind of celebration and farewell. Marcus read poetry, James played music, Lily brought flowers from her garden, Sarah gifted Eleanor a watercolor showing the shop's exterior in that particular golden light we all loved. We told stories, shared memories, expressed gratitude for what Eleanor had created and maintained. When it was my turn to speak, I found I could say very little. My throat closed around words that felt too small for what I wanted to express. Finally, I simply said, "Thank you, for the map, for helping me find my way." Eleanor smiled and hugged me. "You found your own way," she said. "I just held the door open." On a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 1 year after I'd first found Midnight and Company, Eleanor left. We stood together one last time in the shop, surrounded by books and memory and affection. "You'll do wonderfully," she said. "Trust the shop, trust the books, trust the readers who find their way here, and trust yourself you already know everything you need to know. The rest will teach itself to you as you need it." "Will I see you again?" "Perhaps," she said. That's the lovely thing about stepping sideways. You're not really gone, just existing in a different way, in a different story. Pay attention. I have a feeling our narratives will cross again. And then she walked out the door, down the curved street, and turned a corner into whatever came next, leaving me alone in Midnight and Company, its newest keeper, its latest guardian, one more in a long line of people who'd understood the importance of protecting spaces where reading could be slow and attention could be full and time could move at its own pace. The first days were overwhelming. I made mistakes, forgot procedures, couldn't find books I knew I'd seen somewhere. But gradually I found my rhythm. The shop taught me, just as Eleanor had promised. I learned to trust my intuition about which books to recommend, which readers needed conversation and which needed silence, which questions to answer and which to leave hanging in the air like seeds waiting for the right moment to germinate. New readers began appearing, people who'd never visited when Eleanor was here, but who somehow knew that the shop was ready for them now. I recognized in their faces my own first visit, that mixture of relief and recognition, the sense of finally finding a place that existed on a frequency matching their own. I continued mapping not just the city now, but the shop itself, creating emotional cartographies of the space I was coming to know so intimately. I charted which corners offered the most comfort at different times of day, where light fell most beautifully through the seasons, which chairs cradled which kinds of grief or joy most effectively. These maps I hung in the tower room Eleanor had shown me, adding my work to the collection of all the keepers who'd come before. Autumn deepened, the light growing longer and more golden, the air taking on that quality of nostalgia and completion that October brings. The shop settled into its rhythms, and I settled into mine. I learned that running Midnight and Company meant being both present and invisible, present enough to help when needed, invisible enough to allow readers the space to make their own discoveries. On quiet afternoons, when rain fell soft against the windows and the shop wrapped itself around me like a familiar blanket, I would sometimes feel Eleanor's presence, not literally, but as warmth, as approval, as the sense that I was doing what needed doing, that the work was good and important even in its small, quiet way. And sometimes, very rarely, when the light fell just right and I was paying exactly the right kind of attention, I would glimpse other figures moving between the shelves. August, with his ancient eyes and gentle smile, Clara, with her careful hands, Santiago with his musical maps. The previous keepers of this place, still here in some fashion, still tending to the books and the readers and the quiet magic that existed in the space between pages. Seasons turned. The shop moved through its cycles. Readers came and went, finding what they needed, returning or not according to their own rhythms. I grew into my role, learned its contours, discovered that the work was exactly what I needed, not to fill some void or prove some worth, but simply to do each day with attention and care, creating space for others to find their own ways. And I understood, finally, what Iris had learned in The Cartographer's Daughter, that maps aren't really about destinations, but about the act of charting itself, the practice of attention, the choice to notice and record and honor the journey. That we're all cartographers in our own ways, mapping the territories of our lives, creating charts that help us understand where we've been and who we've become in the going. Late one evening, as autumn prepared to give way to winter and the first frost touched the garden outside, I sat in the chair beneath the brass lamp, my chair now, though I still thought of all who'd sat there before me, and opened a blank journal I'd been saving for this moment. On the first page I wrote, "New maps require new journeys." And then I began to write my own story, my own map of this strange and wonderful year, charting the territory between lost and found, between accident and purpose, between the person I'd been and the person I was becoming. Outside, the city moved at its usual frantic pace. Inside, midnight and company, time moved slowly, kindly, measured not by clocks, but by pages turned and breaths deepening, and the gradual transformation of people who'd come seeking maps, and discovered instead that they'd already arrived exactly where they needed to be. The rain continued its gentle percussion against the windows. The lamp glowed warm. The books waited, patient and wise, full of all the maps anyone could ever need. And in that moment, in that space, surrounded by stories and silence and the accumulated wisdom of everyone who'd ever understood that reading was really about attention, about presence, about choosing to move slowly through a fast world in that moment, I was home. And somewhere in the city, I knew, someone was walking without purpose, following streets that curved like question marks, about to turn a corner and discover a bookshop they'd never noticed before, a door waiting to open, a story waiting to begin. The work continues. It always does. That's the nature of sanctuary. It must be continuously created and maintained, protected and renewed, passed from one keeper to the next in an endless chain of attention and care. And I am here, will be here, holding the door open, maintaining the space, trusting that the right readers will find their way to midnight and company when they're ready, that the books will find them, that maps will reveal themselves, and that slowly, gently, kindly, each person who enters will discover what I discovered, that sometimes the destination isn't a place at all, but a way of being, a method of moving through the world with openness and attention, and the understanding that getting lost is often the first step to being found. The evening deepens. The lamplight holds. The books breathe softly on their shelves. And outside, the city dreams its complicated dreams while here. In this quiet corner where time moves differently, stories wait to be discovered, and readers wait to be transformed, and maps wait to be drawn by anyone willing to pay attention, to move slowly, to trust that the journey itself is the destination, and that home is always closer than we think, sometimes as close as the turning of a page.